Joe Mullings from 160 Studios, and I've got a fantastic guest in studio today, David Uffer. David is with Alira and is going to be introducing to us a recent report that came out from Alira about the robotic assisted surgery marketplace. So pretty cool, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joe.
This is a really interesting report, and I will tell you, it's a pretty courageous report because the moment this comes out, it's already old news with the activity going on in the market today.
I agree with you, Joe. This report has been in production for the past year. We started a specialty practice at Alira 3 years ago in robotic assisted surgery. And you're right, every day I wake up, there's another robotic assisted surgery company I see across the entire marketplace. And there's another deal, there's another funding event, what have you, that we see. So it has to be a living document, which we intend to do. But you're right, it's a fast-paced moving environment there.
Yeah. The market and the categories here, you were pretty comprehensive. I don't know how many, this was about 90 pages if I'm not mistaken. So it was, I'm a little bit of a nerd. It was good weekend reading for me, and I ripped it apart and marked it up and I sent it around. So your team did a really nice job on this. I picked a couple slides that I wanted to sort of dig into a little bit, if you wouldn't mind. And you know, this one hit me in a number of ways. You know, this is where you need to have a highly competitive platform, a platinum standard in nearly every single one of these, whether it's the imaging, the brightness, the motion scaling, the magnification, the ergonomics, and the articulation. If you're showing up with anything less than an A or A+, it almost feels like you might be left behind.
You could feel left behind, but I don't know if any one company can be the top in every one of those categories. That's a factor of where they started in technology development and where they continue, their core capabilities. The IP is certainly a limiting factor in some of those areas, which we all recognize. And then the ability to execute. So I think each of the companies have picked where they believe that they have the ability to enter into the marketplace with the right format of different components of each of these key factors that will either enhance the system or make it more marketable.
Yeah, and it sets up also for something that MedTech was not for a long time, but an open architecture system. And you know, with the rate of change of technology right now, if you have a robotic system, you're usually putting your flag in the ground a couple years ago. And with the rate of acceleration of technology, change, the market's still a pretty young market that we didn't know what we didn't know 2 or 3 years ago, either from a cognitive load on the surgeon, work teams, clinical interface, this whole digital play, the introduction of telehealth. So if you put that flag in the ground a couple years ago, you might have gotten market share if you were commercial, only a couple on the soft tissue side, certainly ortho more. But then now what you've got to do is you constantly got to be either cashing the chips on or paying for the past sins of the decisions you made on your platform.
I think all the companies in development today really have to think 10 years out from a couple perspectives. Where's the market going to be from all of the collaboration components of different enhancements, as you talked about, and how are they going to fit in that ecosystem? They don't have to have all the solutions, but they certainly need to know where their offering is going to fit in the ecosystem relative to those other components 5 and 10 years out from now. And as you said, it still is an early market. Intuitive started this revolution you know, over a decade ago, but others have started to make offerings across the entire surgical field, not just in laparoscopy. So we have to understand where the market's going to be and how they'll fit in there.
Yeah, and what's really interesting too is that while this is, you know, you and I grew up in medtech, and for the most part, it really wasn't digital. You could say, you know, CT scanners, MR scanners, there was a digital component to it, but for the most part, this industry has been an episodic delivery of care on a table, and it was either doing plumbing or carpentry, right? Or maybe a little electrical work, right, on the neuro side of things. Now suddenly, when we start to have these digital products, when you used to have to integrate an extrusion machine into a manufacturing environment, it wasn't real hard. Now, when you start to acquire other technologies and integrate them into a software, firmware, hardware platform, that integration and that sort of architecture that was set up 3-5 years ago doesn't happen as easy.
It doesn't, and I think that that's a core point. And let's be clear, this was a robotic-assisted surgery report talking about the robotic systems, but they are enabling technologies that give access not into the peritoneal cavity, but around the peritoneal cavity. In the example of laparoscopy, they allow dexterity, they allow maneuverability, and they allow some more ease of use from the surgeon perspective to be able to perform those procedures that they're deploying robotics across. But the real difference in the outcomes is going to come from digitizing all of the information, all of the data, all of the analytics that are in this operative environment. And to the point that you made at the end of that comment, the perioperative process. And we've talked about this with all of our clients along the entire continuum of care of perioperative conditioning of that patient before they get to the OR, performing a great surgical procedure, and then monitoring and having the surveillance of that patient post-operatively. The robot allows them to perform that procedure, but the perioperative care with all the data that comes into the entire process is where the greatest outcomes will be impacted. And that's why I said we have to look at where the market's going to be 5 and 10 years and how to integrate all of this digital technology development into the robotics as well.
And what's interesting too is, and I agree with you, I think the robot eventually becomes ubiquitous. All it is delivery system for the value that we're getting, and offers up advisement to the clinician while she or he is in, or their work team is in the middle of a surgery, saying, okay, based upon 7,000 other surgeries with this type of data we have on this patient and imaging, where you are right now, we're going to recommend that you consider this, this, and this. You pull the trigger, but here's what we're going to recommend. And I bring that up because I was on the phone with one of the, let's call it lap robotic companies today. And I need to verify this number, but a number was spit out on the Zoom. And he said, in order to become a world-class lap surgeon, you've got to have 30,000 hours of surgery under your belt from when you first started. Now, to fly a plane with 400 people on, you only need 8,000 hours, right? So I'm saying, okay, so how do I make that a scalable model, and can technology tremendously accelerate that and maybe pull that back to 10,000 hours, because that natural skill you have and then the learned skill you have, right? You can only learn that from actually doing the surgery. So if I can put a robot and extend that out and give you better advisement in the middle of a surgery, and then give you better dexterity and access, does that basically improve the care, the outcomes, and also the access, allowing more surgeons to be more places?
Look, the surgeons can get trained a little bit more efficiently and effectively, surely on robotic systems, as we look at a lot of these virtual trainers that are out there. I mean, in our day of laparoscopy, when folks were converting from open laparotomy to laparoscopy, you would stand in a trainer box, a little plastic piece, and try to put a washer on a post. And you would do that all day long in your residency and then go in the OR. We're able to do this digitally now, and with many different training models. We all know that data is out there, that to even be a proficient robotic surgeon, there's a learning curve, and you have to do X amount of cases to do that. But as you're saying, for a laparoscopist, the training hours in that procedure, learning how to do planar dissection, is just insurmountable. So can we accelerate that? Certainly through new digital technologies. The digital side of that, though, Joe, as you're alluding to, is making it a little bit more informed, so I don't have to worry about coming across and clipping a ureter, or knowing that if I lift this organ out of the way, I might have a tear, or that there's a vessel that I might puncture along that. And that's through, again, taking all of the information that we get across millions of surgeries globally a year. Now, the question that we're going to have, and we all face, and we talk to clinicians, different disparate systems globally, is how do we get access to that data and share that? That's another topic.
That's a whole other topic. And I see irresponsibly people throwing around, it's the digital, it's the data. I'm like, we haven't even established an agreed upon language yet.
Correct.
In that OR, in that cath lab, when it comes to this digital. When I say elephant, everybody knows what elephant means. But when I start throwing around digital, the surgical environment has not agreed upon a dialect yet. And so with that, I always wonder, how are we going to harness all that data? So it's an interesting point. This slide, I picked this one out too. This is interesting because the growth across the world and the year-over-year compounded growth of all of the robotic market is pretty profound, and you've got to be in it.
We see this across many different areas, not just in laparoscopy. That's, again, how it started, but we see in just about every surgical or interventional market, the robotic system is being developed, introduced, and utilized. We're pretty bullish on this. Why? For so many different factors. We would need a 6-hour recording. But the baseline is they're making people more precise, and they're given access to what we would project after training and after development to more clinicians, if we can make these more intelligent systems. But I think that we always look for early adopters that establish a use case, validate the use case, and then drive adoption through dissemination of training, dissemination of better outcomes. And what we have to get to, we're not quite there yet, is the cost effectiveness of the systems.
Yeah. And you're only going to be able to build that data set if you get enough surgeries done and enough outcomes. And what are you measuring? So there's values that are measurable and have value 3 days out, but there's also values and you know, your sample sizes for what does that mean 2 years out or 4 years out. One of the other things, this slide, let me jump one here. This one. So this one was really interesting. So when I think about a robot and those who are now trying to get a robot over the line, it's more than a robot. It's the development of a robot, the ongoing R&D with the robot, the ongoing releases, the installs, the service, the training, the clinical team required around that robot in the procedure. This is not made for 50-person catheter development companies in structural heart. This is made for juggernauts. So one of two categories have to occur. It's all going to go up to the strategics, or soon to be robotic-centric companies that will own that land on the big format robots, or our definition of robot needs to change. And our definition of robot needs to be augmenting skills, adding advisory in the middle of surgery, and then potentially increasing efficiencies of the system. And I saw one of these on here. I saw, where is it? I saw Harrell's company, and I know we don't want to pimp
Exact.
one. Yeah, Exact, right? So that's a robot the size of a laptop that sits on somebody's, you know, abdomen, and then another one of his is Microbot, that they toss it out when they're done. It's a disposable robot.
Right.
So I really am excited to see that coming outside of just the big format robots. Any insight on that?
Look, this is a snapshot. This was illustrative.
Yeah.
This was not comprehensive into the marketplace. We've counted almost 150 robotic systems in development and through to commercial status.
Yeah.
And there's a different value proposition and different solution. It really depends on the clinician, the procedure that you're developing this for. Now, you can start in one procedure and look to go more lateral, and some are going more vertical, depending on what segment they're in. And one thing that we also didn't discuss was the site of service. Something might be appropriate for a giant multi-arm robotic system that goes into the OR, but how do you translate that into the economics, the footprint, and the scalability for going to an ambulatory surgery center? The ASCs are growing exponentially now, and people are trying to drive down the cost of certain procedures. You can't do that in an OR setting. And they're quite amenable to ASCs from an efficiency and a cost-effective standpoint. Are you going to have these million-dollar robotic systems there, or are they satisfied with either a single arm, a two-arm modular system, or even a handheld? That might be as amenable. The other component of that is when we look at the giant systems that we call them, are they going to be open architecture or closed? And those are other considerations too. Is it going to be the very large commercial players, or can single offering companies in robotics survive and create a market for them to participate in as well? Or are they going to establish a use case and then be acquired.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting point. See, I had coined this a couple of years ago when I started covering robotics. Robotics is also a here, hold this mentality. So be bedside, hold my scope, right? You know, again, here I saw, so you got active surgical, right? So active surgical is an interesting play. Todd Houston's company, and you got a scope, and their ability to characterize tissue amongst the other things is really interesting, right? And that may get incorporated with a robotic play that is bedside mounted, that basically will just hold that active vision, active edge platform in it. And if that augments, advises, which active does, right? And eventually automates a decision or a workflow, does that categorize as a robot, right? And I think that is really exciting about our industry. And then this previous slide, let's talk about this. Changing centers of care. And we can keep it in robots and we can keep it in med tech in general. So we've moved away, or moving away from that big monolithic building in the middle of town we call a hospital, right? Because hospitals are good at a lot of things and they need to survive for everybody, right? However, these changing centers of care, these ambulatory surgical centers, these focus factories, you're now selling. I'm going to be curious to see what these robotic companies do on their sales, because now you're selling to an owner. That the surgeon owns the surgery center, or the PE firm that's backed the surgeon owns the surgery center. And the PE firm is now loaded with analysts and statistics, no longer a purchasing arm in a hospital. And what do PE firms do? They're going to look at the largest expenses, the top 8 expenses, and they're going to figure out, how do we carve those out? How do we increase our efficiencies? So sales organizations in medtech are not used to selling to that model and coming up with evidence on it. So I agree with you. The purchase proposal, the purchase evaluation, and the post-sales support is no longer in some of these ASCs going to be tied to, here's the robot, and by the way, you've got to buy all these implants in order to justify that price. So that's going to, I think, throw a curveball into this industry.
Well, one point along that, look at the bottom line level, if they're going to be PE owned, or even look, a lot of the ASCs are being driven by hospitals that are setting these up and spending capital to build these for an extension, because it is not as economic in some procedures to do those in an OR, and they can be much more efficient and then economic outside of the core acute care OR setting. Whichever it is, it could be for marketing purposes. So the PE might say, look, this is going to cost us $1 million, but that advertising or that drive to draw people in, and look, we understand in certain elements, that's how our robotic systems today have driven patients into the facilities.
Pull through on that
as well.
I know a number of hospital administrators down here in Florida that they tell me part of that prop, just you said, is when I put an intuitive system in here, or I can say you can get a Makoplasty here. In fact, you go along 95 here on the way up to Palm Beach, there was a billboard not to get a Makoplasty, like not even any longer a hip replacement, you get a branded Makoplasty. And you know, some lady from Palm Beach goes, I want a Makoplasty, where do I go? And that is a pull through on these procedures.
A huge marketing pull through. I mean, you brought up intuitive, and strength of them after prostatectomy was in gynecology, driving hysterectomies there. And I was actually on my way to Proctor, a hysterectomy case in Columbus, Ohio, and 3 billboards on my way to the case. Robotic hysterectomy.
It's crazy. And again, some of these in here, again, not to pull out any, because I know you can't have any favorites, and these are just organizations that I'm super aware of, but I think you're right. These are changing every single day. I love what Cambridge is doing. I think they're a great marketing machine with a really interesting platform. It's Adam Sachs with Vicarious. I've been watching closely on that one for sure. And then you got Ottava that was just pushed out a couple years, and these big strategics that now have to worry about getting somebody in the game could drive M&A. And then finally, this one. I love this, and you had pointed out this list can continue to go down if we had a bigger screen. Clearly, robotic-assisted surgery is infiltrating pretty much all of these verticals and these therapies.
Yeah, when I said, Joe, this could go out here, we were following very closely a company that just placed $10 million in ophthalmology. I mean, we're seeing this in every area. at least as far as the report was concerned. I got a call from somebody saying, well, where's the rehab and the exoskeleton side of it? And to actually get the report out there and not be 300 pages long, we had to cut at some point. But every aspect of healthcare is seeing robotics come into it. And I think that's what the point of this report was, to let the investors understand what the landscape is, why there's so much in development, the rationale for that, and where we project the market to be growing in along different areas. All of the strategics, as I said, had to have a rationale and a strategy for what is our position going to be, not today, but in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, and it could be sit on the sidelines, it could be invest, it could be acquire at this point, but they have to have a thesis and a proposition for their company. And then all of the companies in development really have to understand what's that go-to-market strategy, what are we trying to solve in the clinical process, in the procedural process, and how are we going to get there, and technology, and market access including who's going to pay for this, and then and how we're going to go to different markets, whether it's site of service, emerging markets, European versus U.S. markets, and the entire go-to-market global strategy.
Yeah, and I think this entire category, I'm really thankful for Alira putting this out. It brings up the conversation around this entire category that I hope people are really looking at this. And when you think about putting out a robot, even if it's a small format, so who could potentially acquire you, right? Are there roll-ups? Will we see Intuitive become a robotic company that goes across all of these? Or will it be one of the strategics who tries to get into robotics, defending the moat that they already have built around these, right? Like a J&J, for example. They are not a surgical device company, arguably. They're a pharma company, a consumer company that does great work in medical device. I said that, you didn't say that, right?
Thank you.
So, yeah, but that's a CapEx play. And then you see somebody like Siemens with Dave Pacitti, who came from a stent catheter company. Siemens, how are they going to move the needle over the next decade unless they go interventionally? Oh, maybe they buy Corindus and they go from a pure imaging company to now an interventional company that's playing in something they know, CapEx. They pretty much got hardware in every single setting in a hospital anyway. And now they can start to connect digitally across those. Well, let's toss Proximie in the middle of that, who can now, through a telehealth play, be the mortar for all of these players and become a partnership or a cross-licensing. So it's fascinating what's going on. I'm really glad Alira put this out and is sharing it with the community.
Joe, I'm glad you mentioned that, because to that point, to us, while we came out with this first, and the next part of this series is about intelligent surgery, about digital surgery, about digitally enhanced and advanced surgery. But this is the start of the core to that, because to be an imaging company and go into procedures and into robotics, as we started the conversation, it's all about data acquisition and making meaningful use out of that data. So how do I incorporate my pre-operative imaging to making a smarter pre-surgical plan to now doing my intraoperative surgery with that approach that I knew I was going to go into and be smarter during that procedure, to watch out knowing that I could get into this position that I might have a critical structure, or a compromise, or I'm taking the best angle and approach, or the best pathway if I'm going interventional or endovascular or even endoluminal. These are all about having better environment to do the procedure with the knowledge of across the entire continuum of that process of delivering the care.
Agreed. And so I think, part of my hypothesis is, I think big iron in 10 years from now, meaning the Philips, the Siemens, right? They could be the clear and present threat to the analog surgical device companies that are not jumping in. And I don't know how you jump into digital if you aren't at least with your foot in the pool. Like if you're a Boston Sci and you really haven't jumped into there at all, and you don't even know what and you haven't stepped in the ring and took a beating, how do you catch up with a digitally oriented company like a Siemens, right? And who will be in that entire interventional space. So no favorites, not throwing shade on anybody, but these are questions that if for me, if you're betting your career on things, you better be thinking about, if you're an investor, you're thinking about it another way. If you're a strategic or a startup, you have to be asking these questions around the table.
I'd say everybody I advise, or we advise, we take that perspective. We can do a singular diligence or study of a particular system, but we back up 3 steps and say, let's think about the bigger picture and where you want to be incorporating all of what you just mentioned, or we're just taking baby steps and somebody's going to leapfrog you 5 years ahead of where you are. And you might be taking these steps and the door's just going to slam shut on you at that point. So I agree, you have to be thinking across the entire digital continuum. And if you don't have that in plans, you know, these systems are going to be relegated to irrelevant as far as all of the information that you need to make them successful.
Agreed.
And they won't deliver the value. I think that's our biggest challenge right now, and why we haven't seen beyond high single digits the proliferation. A, the cost. B, the value that they're driving back to the system. I mean, we could pull up a ton of reports that have all been characterized on the cost of a ventral hernia repair, robotic or laparoscopic. And you can argue the different values of a hysterectomy or a prostatectomy or even a right colectomy. I think you could see different studies, but we know that they're not delivering the total value. There's other value points of driving that, and I don't negate those at all. But when we look at the cost and the greater value, we have to be smarter with these systems.
Yeah, agree. Well, I appreciate it. Appreciate Alira for sharing the love on the report, and thanks for coming down to Delray and to 160 Studios for spending time.
Enjoyed it, Joe. Thank you.
Always, always. I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.